Hello, everybody. Thank you for having us. We don't have a moderator, so why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, we have sort of an emergent order here on the stage. We have absolutely no organization whatsoever. I am Peter St. Onge. I'm an economist, and I make daily videos.
I'm Bruce Fenton. I've been in the Bitcoin space for 10 years now, and it's never been a dull moment. I'm mostly focused on securities and TradFi and the conversions with Bitcoin. And I'm one of the 3 Americans here to talk about Europe.
Yeah, and I'm Mark Moss. I make a lot of content in the Bitcoin space. I'm also an investor in the space with the Bitcoin Opportunity Fund. And love talking to these guys, so it's going to be fun.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, I guess I'm going to jump in and be moderator for the first third of the session here. Okay, Mark. So, Fourth Turning comes from a book.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us what the shtick is there?
Yeah, the Fourth Turning is basically outlining like about an 80-year cycle. I say about, it's not exact, obviously. And within that 80-year cycle, there's 4 20-year periods within that. So there's 4 turnings in that cycle. I would like to throw out, when you're looking at cycles, there's typically, like if you're looking at technical analysis, there's like 3 triple bottoms or triple tops, which makes it strong. So 3 times 80 is a 250-year cycle, which is even bigger. But right now we're talking about the 80-year cycle. So on this 4th cycle, which we're in right now, arguably, it's sort of like this Lenin quote that said that there's decades where nothing seems to happen, and then there's days where decades seem to happen. So all the change happens at the end in this last turning. It's sort of this really taken from this generational theory. So that means that each generation passes down different traits to the next person. You guys have heard this meme kind of thrown out before of the hard times create strong men, so to speak. We'll talk about that more. But that's really what it is. These 4 20-year cycles that total an 80-year cycle, about the average lifespan of a person. Arguably, we're in that last one. So we'll talk about what that is, and maybe this history will tell us where the world goes next.
And more broadly speaking, so the concept Fourth Turning comes from the book.
Right, a book.
But the idea is very old, so it's maybe 2,500 years old at this point. The idea that the world runs in these cycles. So, you know, the meme that Mark was talking about, the good times make weak men make hard times. I think we're all familiar with that. And that's actually from Polybius in 150 BC. So the idea has been around a long time. And I think a lot of us, both in Europe and in the US, feel as if we are now in that decline stage. A lot of people are sort of waiting for something bad to happen at this point. I know certainly in terms of economics, we have a lot of trends that are very unsustainable. We have the government that is taking more and more power. Of course, taking many more freedoms. We had a dramatic acceleration of that over the past couple of years. And, you know, now we have multiple wars that are going on around the world. They seem to be starting quite quickly at this point. And the government seems to be feasting on these, converting these into power and resources seized from the people. And I think a lot of us, sort of to harken back to another historical analogy, a lot of us sort of feel as if the water is boiling, the frog is getting ready to jump, and we are not sure exactly what happens when that frog jumps, if it's going to be an improvement, if it's going to be something dramatic that we would rather not live through, but we're all going to be forced to. And Bruce, do you have thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, I've been interested in this theory for a while. When the first book came out by Strauss and Howe in 94, 96, something like that, there was a lot of economists who looked at it as a way to predict kind of a bull market, really, going from, you know, there was a lot of people who said, hey, we're going to have a big bull market. And those same people, Strauss has passed away, but Howe wrote a book that, you know, says the fourth turning is here. They basically predicted exactly this period in their book 30 years ago. They said that, you know, right around between 2020 and 2024, you're going to have this turmoil. They didn't know why, just like we didn't know that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was going to set off World War I. That incident, had that happened at a different point in history, it would have been just another assassination. But as we see now, you know, little things can become big things in these times of chaos. And it started most noticeably around, you know, March of 2020 or so with the global reaction. I'm always careful to say it wasn't the COVID, it was the reaction to the COVID. It's a very big difference. It was the government reaction, the tyrannical reaction. And that created just an unraveling of things. Things have felt shaky. You feel like you're on thin ice and things are breaking. And part of that is good because the generational theory that goes along with this, it has a lot to do with the generations of people as well and how old people are. You have big baby boom waves. There was a baby boom here in Europe. There was a baby boom in the United States. So you had a quadrupling in population. 4 times as many people were born than before the baby boom. So that's a big deal. So when you have 70 million in the United States, 70 million school-age kids, they had to build a bunch of schools, just like they did here in Europe. And in the United States, the condo market was super hot when those people were in their mid-20s. But then when they were in their mid-30s, the condo market crashed and the suburban market picked up. And you see those same trends all over the world. You see it wherever they had a baby boom or wherever you have these generational changes. A generation of 70-year-olds is going to behave very differently than a generation of 25-year-olds. They're going to vote differently. They're going to have different policies. So part of the good thing about this is that you have this natural cycle. I've heard it also compared to seasons, the 4 seasons. This is something that, as we mentioned, has been around a long time. So you have these, kind of seasons and death and rebirth and spring. And there's something healthy about these old, antiquated, high-power institutions kind of reaching their peak, and that's what we're seeing now. A lot of these institutions that started their power in the beginning of the last fourth turning, the New York Times and the media and the World Economic Forum at Davos and this kind of stuff that's kind of part of this generation, they're all kind of dying now. CNN is being replaced by Joe Rogan, and nobody cares, or at least they shouldn't care as much about all these big centralized organizations as they used to. And we have new rise of power, and I think the best theme of that of all is Bitcoin. That's new money for a new time, and it's coming into the world at exactly the right time.
So one of the things that we talked about before coming on was, because we are in Europe, is how the turnings really matched up really all over the world as a result of World War II. You could argue World War I and World War II were sort of a single unit because they were so tied together. But that sort of put us all at the same starting line at the same time, not only in Europe and the US, but even in places like Japan. And so, Mark, do you want to make some comments on that?
Yeah, so obviously different nations have different cycles, but sort of as Pete led to, because of World War II and really kind of going earlier through the industrialization process, but after World War II, sort of everybody kind of reset on that cycle, and as Bruce said, because of the baby boom generations that happened after that. So really, if you look at it, it's been about 80 years since World War II has ended. After World War II, we entered an era of peace, as well as the entire global financial system changed under the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was about 78-ish years ago. And if you think about this sort of fourth turning model, again, the hard times create strong men. So after World War II, unfortunately, after lots of men died, most of Europe got bombed out. There was obviously the story of what happened with Germany having to rebuild and the Weimar Republic and all of that. It created massive amounts. And just take Germany as an example. It had created very, very, very hard times for Germany specifically. Even harder times in Germany than the rest of Europe. And because of that, those hard times created really strong men, which then created really good times. And Germany has become the economic engine of Europe. But today, 80 years later, that's all over. Germany is now deindustrializing. They decided to shut off their power. They decided to turn off their nuclear power. And now they're deindustrializing. Now a lot of their factories are moving to China, moving to the United States and other places. And so that's an 80-year cycle. That's like a perfect evidence of this. But it also matches up with the rest of Europe, also matches up with the United States as well. Obviously, coming out of World War II, we didn't get our nation bombed out like what happened in Europe, but still we had to recover from that. And here we are 80 years later, and I think we're starting to see similar declines happening. And a lot of it is because what happens is the people that are making the decisions today are so far removed from reality. So they are now eating from the food that they never planted. And so much wealth was created in the United States and in Europe. So much wealth was created that now we have future generations that are living off of that wealth but have never produced that wealth. They weren't the ones that created this industrialized world, created all of these new technologies, and built up these surpluses that today we're living off of. And so we're so far removed from reality, making decisions that make no sense, which is why that fourth turning, which is eventually the weak men making bad times. And so that's kind of where we're at.
So I want to sort of mention that when we talk about that narrative with Germany being prostrate post-war, and of course France, the Netherlands, I was told very clearly not to say Holland, to say the Netherlands. Most of Western Europe was prostrate, but in many ways, East Europe followed a very different trajectory, right? And today we're sort of seeing that. Like they had kind of a double dip into disaster. So Bruce, do you have any thoughts on what's happening there?
Yeah, I think it's more... Probably the situation is more to do with, communism and philosophy and socialism than it is to do with the generations. But they're related in that the way that generations think, they think differently. Millennials are different than baby boomers, and the greatest generation before the baby boomers was called that for a reason. They were a great generation here and all over the world, and as you mentioned, the generation kind of running things now doesn't even really remember those people. They don't know how to do things. They don't know how to make the money the way they did. They don't know how to be that economic engine, and that's a danger. And because then you have cluelessness, and we have this in the United States. You have clueless people who just don't know how the world works. They just don't understand. They're 2-3 generations removed from the people who had their act together, so they believe all kinds of insanity, and then they don't understand profits and profitability and how to work a company. And it's become a joke in the United States that companies are trying to hire foreign CEOs because in the United States we've been completely corrupted by this kind of woke mind virus that is very, against the common KPIs of what makes a business work. Instead of focusing on, building products and making things, they're focusing on all kinds of political, weird activism stuff. And that's not true everywhere in the world. It's not true in Singapore, for example. And it definitely wasn't true in Europe just a few decades ago, but now you have a different generation. Millennials are different, and Gen Z is different. I think, unfortunately, for millennials, they got kind of the worst of everything. They got the most debt and the least efficiency, and as a result, unfortunately, there's a lot of members of that generation who are kind of apathetic, and they don't see hope, for a good reason often. So, I'm putting some hope in Gen Z. And one of the things that I'd like to ask both of you also out of this is kind of, how do you, I don't know about take advantage from this. How do you not be harmed by this change, or maybe take advantage, maybe profit, maybe come out of this chaos? For me personally, I'm looking to Gen Z. I think there's a lot of hope in Gen Z. And if you're a millennial, you can just kind of go along with that wave. There's no rule book that says if you're born before 1982 or whatever, you're on one side or the other. Even with me as being a Generation X, I would rather align with if I was going to join a startup or something, I'd kind of look to Gen Xers, because I think that you want to be on the positive side of this rebuilding. The institutions, the people, the generation. It's going to be up to Gen Z to rebuild this mess. And unfortunately, the other thing is, historically, these times of chaos have gotten worse. So when I say this mess, I don't mean what's just happened over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, I think that we're going to see more chaos and more turmoil, and unfortunately, more bloodshed over the next, hopefully it'll be soon. Hopefully it'll be a year or less, but it could be 7 or 8 years, based on how history looks.
And one of the things we were also talking about is that if you go back through history and you look at these turnings, sometimes when you get to that strong men stage or strong people, it can actually lead to wider freedoms, right? So, for example, the American Revolution, it was a chaotic period. Strong men did take over. It was effectively a military junta who imposed their will forevermore on the country via the Constitution. But what came out of that was a revitalization of freedom. But that's rare, right? We were mentioning before the break that in the wake of Napoleon's destruction of Europe, you did not get a revitalization of freedom. You actually got stronger kings.
Yep. Yeah, I think what comes next, I think, is the answer that we all want to try to figure out, because we want to position ourselves, as Bruce said, right? Try to position ourselves on the right side, skating to where the puck is going to be, so to speak. And so what does come next? We can see that both the American Revolution and the French Revolution ended up in two different places. The American Revolution ended up in a decentralized world, so we set up a constitutional republic where each state was independent. And a lot of that was because they took parts of what was good and rebuilt from there, where the French Revolution completely destroyed everything and rebuilt from scratch. And so you can see even that ended up in different locations. I think if I'm going to guess where I think the future goes, if I'm going to look at my crystal ball, it's not super clear, but I think I'd have to go back a little bit further. So as I said, right, if you look back through 3 generations or 3 different fourth turnings, then you'll see that typically we go from like a pendulum swinging from centralization to decentralization. A lot of the reason why this generational theory works is because as humans, even though the future progresses exponentially because of technology, it's not linear, it's exponential, but because we're humans, we continue to have cycles that repeat. We take things too far, so then we correct, and then we overcorrect too far. And then we go back and we go too far. So we basically swing back and forth like a pendulum. And basically we kind of, if you look back through thousands of years of history, you see we kind of go towards centralization, and we really lump together, and technology plays a big piece of this. We have to talk about that. But about 250 years ago, we got a new technological revolution called the Industrial Revolution, which moved everybody into cities and factories. We created mass manufacturing, and everybody moved into these cities. And so we got this massive centralization. Governments became big in centralization. But now technology is allowing us to start to decentralize. Now many of us work on the internet, small businesses, moving around the world. And so the shape of the governments will also have to change because of the technology. And so if I'm going to guess where this future goes, what happens after this fourth turning, looking back through history, looking at the technology that we have today, I think the future is decentralized and not centralized. I think we've all started to see the problems of having too much centralization. In the United States, having one regime controlling 330 million people, or today, the UN and the IMF and the BIS trying to control the whole world, 8 billion people, it's just never going to work. We also have the technology that's changing things. As I said, no longer do we have these giant corporations, this mass manufacturing, so mass government for that. Now we have the internet. Now we have Bitcoin, which is now a decentralizing technology. And so I think the future is decentralized.
All right, and Bruce. So Bruce, speaking of Bitcoin, so we have never gone through this kind of turning where we actually had that kind of decentralized control over the money. Of course, the money is half the world, maybe more than half the world. So comment on where you think it...
I agree with you. I think that the pendulum is going to swing the other way, and I don't think we realize just how tyrannical our lives are right now, just how much tyranny. You know, we're sort of free, and there's always things that are worse. But there's just an army of bureaucrats and busybodies who are stealing from your wallets every single day and then burdening you with rules. And they're everywhere. They're everywhere in Europe. You know, I was in a place, there's 2 different cash registers because one cash register is allowed to sell the aspirin and the other one isn't. I go to get my Uber to go over here, and there's some warning that says, warning, the deal between the contractor at Uber is between you and the contractor, not between Uber. That's some lawyer. That's some busybody pinhead in government who has burdened Uber with this, oh, wait a minute, if you're going to operate in our jurisdiction, you're going to need this disclaimer that you don't need in another area. You don't need this stuff. These people don't add value. 400 years ago, you could walk right down the street and you could trade any stock that existed, and they created an entire new economy. They created the joint stock. The first stock was founded right down the street. And they created the first joint stock, the first common stock equity, and the first trading system. And it became this massive market, created the biggest company the world had ever seen. They didn't have any of these pinheads. The Dutch East India Company was worth $8 trillion in today's dollars. If that company was the size it was then, adjusted for inflation, it would be bigger than Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Tesla, Wells Fargo combined. And they did it without a single pinhead, without a single, AML, KYC, let's get up in your business and have you fill out all these forms. None of that is needed. We do not need that in the economy. The natural economy is what you saw 400 years ago right down the street. It's voluntary interaction between people. It's people saying, I have this orange coin and you have some euros and I want to trade it. And that's all you need. You don't need the others. And you've had this increasing bureaucracy, in some cases very tyrannical and invasive of abusive of human rights and freedom and these kind of things. And you don't need it all. So I'm hoping that we do have to swing the other side. And I hope it all comes crumbling down and those bureaucrats have to get real jobs, let the rest of us innovate and go and do trade.
Yeah. I think about as an American coming to Europe, this is my third time I've been here in the last several months, and I can tell you, even just using the internet here is so much different than using the internet even in America. I mean, you're constantly having to approve this, and I consent to it. Like, we don't have any of that. But I think back to what I said earlier, this fourth turning, where we have this generation now who are so far removed from the real world, and they're making all of these regulations that we have to abide by, but they don't understand what it is to run a business because they've never actually done that. And I think back to a quote from Ayn Rand in the book Atlas Shrugged, and she says, when you must get permission to produce from men who have produced nothing, right? And so we have these people who have never produced anything. They never created a business. They never balanced a budget. They never produced income. They never dealt with customers, but yet they want to pass all these regulations to get in the way between you and your business. And so to kind of Bruce's point, most of this is just unnecessary. Every single transaction, there's a piece getting taken out of it. It slows it down. It takes away our profitability, takes down our growth. And so I think it's going to change.
And it can be very discouraging to people. Anybody who's run a business, I think certainly in Europe, you feel like you're hunted. You feel like just constantly you are pursued by these regulators who have nothing better to do, who literally parasitically consume your life force. And it can be very discouraging, and especially nowadays when we consider things like CBDCs. When we look at the different layers, if you're in Europe, of course, you have your national government, you have the European Union, you have these international treaties that various countries sign to. And so it's like if you were to miraculously capture your national government and free yourself, well, boom, it's like you open the window and there's a brick wall, and you get through that and there's another brick wall. This can be very discouraging for people, but I think that's important to remember. If we look at the experience of the fall of the Soviet Union, I'm sure that was extraordinarily discouraging to people. You could do absolutely nothing. It was a completely permissioned economy. In theory, you would be shot if you sold, bootleg bread out of the back of your car. And yet there was some point where governments collapsed. They largely collapsed because of the money. At that point, when you get hyperinflation, the government has to make a choice. Will it pay the Praetorian Guard, or will it pay the bureaucrat busybodies? And lo and behold, the busybodies get cut pretty darn fast. That's what happened in the Soviet Union. The state begins to look after itself. So I think it's important day to day. Yes, it can get very discouraging, but remember that the people are with us. If you look, I know certainly in the U.S., when Joe Biden came into power, YouTube disabled their thumbs down. Yeah. Because every time Biden opened his mouth, there were so many thumbs downs. It was embarrassing to the regime. You see this persistently across the board, where the regime has its pet media, they have its pet narratives. Nobody is believing that garbage anymore. And so I think that we do eventually get to a point where the entire thing, it looks very impressive, but you look behind it, there's nothing there. It's a Potemkin village, and I think that it does collapse under its own weight.
Yeah, and going back to what Pete was saying, if you look back to the fall of the USSR and what happened there, really, I like to look at the story of it was about their money, but it was because people no longer consented to use that. And so what you see through the USSR, particularly in Romania, where it really kind of kicked off in really high gear, is that people decided to just opt out. Right? The regime, as Pete calls it, I like to call it that as well, the regime gets their power from our compliance. So our silence and our compliance makes us complicit in that. And so in the USSR, because things had gotten so restrictive, you couldn't even get bread, so you'd have to go buy bread in the black market. And next thing you know, they're getting the next thing. And then there's really the films, the movies that really kick things into high gear. And so many people had to go start dealing in a black market, whichever the government doesn't give you a permit for, is technically black market or gray market anymore. And so these parallel markets started moving. It's like if we're having this event and we start kicking all of you guys out, you go form your own event, we no longer have control over you anymore. And so many people exited the system and they started doing all their trade, all their business outside of it, that the regime lost all the power. No longer could they control or control the monetary commands anymore because people had moved on. No longer could they control commerce because people were doing commerce outside. And so really we have the opportunity today, and the reason why I think Bitcoin is so important is because, we talk about different freedoms, the ability to go do things, freedom to transact. And the freedom to transact is really at the base of all the freedoms, because in the United States, for example, we have a constitution that guarantees us freedoms of assembly. But if I can't transact and put gas in my vehicle, how do I drive to the assembly? If I can't get a hotel room when I get there, if I can't get food when I get there, how do I go assemble? Freedom of speech. Well, if you can't get online, if you don't have money, you can't get online, you have no speech. And so really the freedom to transact sits at all of that, which is why, of course, the number one target is going to be the money, control the world. And that's what CBDCs promise to do, for them to have control over us. And that's where Bitcoin really fits in. If there's nothing else that I take away, and you guys should take away from this, is giving us back that freedom to transact.
Yep. I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
I think this is an optimistic vision. You know, it's a scary time. It's a time of chaos. People have been through these times before and worse, and usually the world works out better. And I'm optimistic that we're going to be headed into a new generation of decentralization and freedom. And there's no other option. We have to hope for that. Hopefully it'll be sooner rather than later, but even on the long end, if it's 8 years, 9 years, we will come out of this. We're going to come out stronger, more decentralized, and hopefully with sound money instead of phony fiat.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I would agree with these gentlemen here. I think the absolute most important aspect is that it is under our control. We've had many turnings. Some of them have been very, very difficult. Some of them have been very light, a slight breeze. It is under our control what comes next, and I do think that Bitcoin gives us a huge advantage compared to previous generations. There we go. They got the picture. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Welcome back to the Bitcoin Amsterdam Live Desk, brought to you by Bitcoin Magazine. To my left, I'm joined by both my colleagues, Alex McShane and Chris Salemo. Fellas, we just listened to a great panel put on by Mark Moss, Bruce Fenton, and Peter St. Assange on the fourth turning coming to grips here in Europe. I know as we head into the latter half of the halving here coming in 2020-24, Mark opened up with a fantastic quote saying that there's decades where nothing seems to happen and days where decades seem to happen. And certainly in the last couple of weeks, we've really felt that. Just curious to hear your guys' thoughts on how this, some of the topics that they discussed on the panel, how this is shaping up for the end of 2023 and the beginning half of 2024. Alex, we'll start with you.
Yeah, for sure. So I think first off, they hit the nail on the head. I mean, we're facing, it's not just Europe, but the entire Western world's facing a lot of global deindustrialization, a lot of censorship, government overreach, platform overreach. And in the face of all that, Bitcoin is economic and technological hope for people. And I think people, by wielding tools, even nascent tools like Nostr, using Tor and Bitcoin in tandem, they claw back some of their self-sovereignty as people. And I think over time, this new generation of Bitcoiners and kind of technological savvy people are going to flourish and kind of, you know, come up from the ashes of this fourth turning globally.
Chris, do you think the people of Europe and I guess globally are starting to wake up to the fact that things are not good in the world and that they do need to leverage these technologies that Alex had just mentioned?
Yeah, if 2020 wasn't a wake-up call for many people in the world, I don't know what is. But, you know, a lot of times in the fourth turning, they talk about things need to get much, much worse before they get better. But I do think that there's a lot of hope. There's been a lot of building in the bear market. And I do think things will only get better from here. You know, maybe we saw the worst of it now, and we're basically on an upward trajectory in the future.
Do you have a bullish sentiment, Alex? Do you carry the same kind of attitude as Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Bitcoin is hope. It's the most exciting thing we have. I think we're here a part of like one of the most hopeful, optimistic outlooks on the world. This event that is happening here today. I just don't think other technologies and sort of captured services in the state are providing that same optimism that we feel here today through Bitcoin.
Yeah, certainly. I know, you know, when we put on these events, you know, we especially in lieu of what's happened in Israel and you know, the issues with Hamas and such in the last week. You get into this mode where things aren't feeling good, and then you come here to this event and you have all these fantastic people that are really preaching a word of hope Just curious, as we're coming close to the conclusion of the day, what are some of the highlights here from you guys?
Definitely listening to Edward Snowden was definitely a highlight for me. Really cool. I think he's an American hero, and it was great to hear him talk.
Awesome. Well, we'll come back as we conclude the rest of the day.
Thank you, Miami, for the last 3 years in this amazing city. The whole world shut down, but Miami welcomed us with open arms. We want to show Bitcoin to the whole world. We are taking the conference on the road to set the stage for Bitcoin in a new city. Nashville. Bitcoin 2024 is coming to Nashville in Tennessee, a city that is known as a music and freedom city. Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville from July 25th to 27th.